morning for those of you that are in the US. On behalf of the Barcelona GSE, I would like to welcome you to this policy panel on the aftermaths of COVID. Let me also especially thank our panelists for giving us their time and joining us here today. We have with us Raquel Fernández, who is a professor of economics at New York University and a member of the Barcelona GSE Scientific Council. Philip Lane, who is chief economist and member of the executive board of the European Central Bank. Carmen Reinhart, who is vice president and chief economist of the World Bank. And Andrés Velasco, who is dean of the School of Public Policy at the London School of Economics and former Minister of Finance of Chile. Now, I have asked our panelists to join us here today to discuss the economic recovery from the COVID crisis and its implications going forward. I expect the discussion to last for about an hour, and then we will open the floor to questions. If you want to ask a question, you can send them through the chat box, the Q&A, stating both your name and affiliation, so that I can pass some of them on to the panelists. I will exercise my judgment here and select some questions. Now, I want to point out one thing. We are very lucky in the sense that this panel is unique because its expertise covers a large part of the world economy. Raquel is based in New York, has been following the US situation quite closely. Philip, of course, knows the euro area economy very well. Carmen is at the World Bank, and I'm sure she's immersed in the challenges being faced by developing countries. And Andres is an expert in emerging markets, and in particular in Latin America, which has suffered tremendously from the COVID crisis. In order to make the exchange dynamic, to give everyone a chance to speak, we will structure the discussion around 3 general questions that we will address subsequently. The first is, there are by now clear signs that the world economy is recovering from COVID, although this recovery is unequal both within and between countries. Growing vaccination, but also large-scale fiscal and monetary stimulus have played an important role. What is your take on the state of the recovery and your main concerns regarding fiscal and monetary policy going forward? The second question goes a bit further out in time, taking a more medium-term perspective. Do you think that this pandemic has created persistent challenges and opportunities for the global economy? And the third question, to wrap up, I will ask each one of you, if you had to focus on a single policy issue going forward, which one would it be and why? So let's first discuss the first question on the recovery and challenges for fiscal and monetary policies going forward. We'll do so in alphabetical order, so Raquel will start and we'll take it from there. Each participant has 5 minutes about to discuss this question. Raquel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alberto. Thanks for inviting me. Really happy to be here with such a great panel, and of course with you, Alberto. And let me start with the first question, which is the US emergence from the pandemic. So I would say that on the whole, the US is coming out of the pandemic quite well. It did a really bad job of controlling the disease, both in terms of personal protective equipment, almost zero contact tracing, bad messaging from the Center for Disease Control, almost no sequencing of the virus, had one of the worst death tolls. The numbers that I've put up here that you can just look on your own are per 1 million inhabitants. And as you can see, the US is even above the EU, above Spain, and certainly compared to some other countries, it did not do a good job. Now, it did a much better job of ensuring the vaccine supply and eventually, after some stumbles, at getting vaccines to those who are willing, and I guess the stress is on the word willing, to vaccinate. It had 3 large direct economic assistance packages, and it greatly expanded unemployment insurance and childcare payments. The fall in GDP in 2020 is relatively small. The IMF estimates are 3.5%, as you can see, relative to an average of 6.6% across the Eurozone. And the US went in strong in terms of these packages and stimulus measures. These are numbers that, depending on the country, are current to February or March for the US, 2021. And the US went with 27% of GDP, a humongous, set of packages there. So what are the potential concerns that come out of this? Well, one of them, I think, is people have been talking a lot about is inflation. As you can see, inflation has increased. May 2021, 5%. Some of this is due to the fact that May was particularly low in 2020 in terms of there was disinflation going on. So part of it is that, but not all of it. The other part of it, the question is how much is short run and how much is long run? The short run factors would be supply chain disruptions, bottlenecks. There's increased demand for certain goods. You know, things like used cars and trucks are up 30% on a year-to-year basis. That is because of bottlenecks in the economy and from a switch in demand. Airline fares are up because people are finally traveling in the United States. So those you could expect would finally go away. Then there's the composition of demand. Goods above pre-pandemic trend by some 11%. The demand for services, on the other hand, is still below by some 7% relative to pre-pandemic trends. The other thing that's contributing to inflation is the demand side. Huge amount of savings. This is showing you, just for a few years, more or less the percent of savings out of disposable income was about 7%. Here you see the first month of the pandemic. As you can see, it's been really high relative to the norm ever since. And even this is April of this year, we're still at 15% of savings. So there's a huge amount of savings that people are going to be spending to some extent. The other concern, of course, is employment. Employment has been recuperating slower than what was thought and what was desired. In terms of relative to the pre-pandemic trend, there's about 10 million jobs that are short. And furthermore, the official figures are unemployment, which is about 5.8%, are low relative to the more realistic figures, which take into account labor force participation. And that's because a lot of people seem to now be out of the labor force. Furthermore, when you look at the composition of employment, there's some worrisome signs, which is that although everybody has recovered to some extent, you can see that people who have high school diplomas or less in the United States stayed fairly stagnant from September till now, telling you either there's a demand problem in terms of services or something else is going on. So what might be going on for employment? There's COVID fears. People don't necessarily want to be in closed quarters, and that's important for services. There's the fact that there was particularly generous benefits to some people, it is more than 120% of their earnings, especially at the lower end of the income distribution or the wage distribution. That's going to end. It's going to end for a lot of states, 25 Republican states, basically now, and the rest of the states in September. Then there's more deeper issues, I think, which is that of mismatch. A lot of trends have accelerated in the economy, automation and robotization in particular. And then I think one thing that might not be being picked up, and this is just my own hunch, so I don't know, might be towards self-employment, and those would not be showing up here. So lastly, what else is causing this, or what could be causing this, is government spending. So let's talk about that. You saw it's a very large stimulus. Do we have to worry about the debt burden? I would say, well, if what you're worried about is debt for the United States, I don't think that's a real problem, in the sense that if you look, say, at the 30-year Treasury inflation index Treasury, you'll see that its real rate is basically zero. That means that for 30 years, you can finance a debt at a zero real interest rate. I think more important and more problematic is that this large amount of spending is raising political opposition to more government spending. And there's a lot of things that have to be done in this country, in the United States, particularly with respect to infrastructure, from roads, bridges, rails, to airports, to broadband, et cetera. And then this is really an issue that I'm going to talk about later on, so I'm going to just hold it. I'll talk about inequality and poverty in the United States. Okay, I think I'm done for now.
Thank you, Raquel. Philip?
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So a lot of what Raquel just said, of course, is relevant for the euro area as well. But let me make, I suppose, a basic distinction is that the timeline is a bit different. So the US, as Raquel indicated, is further along in the vaccination process, further along in reopening the economy. And also the nature of the pandemic has been different in Europe. And in particular, in late last year, so going into Q4 or middle of Q4 really, and then extending not only through Q1 this year, but actually even through April. We're really only starting the reopening now in the last few weeks. So Raquel, indicated this pretty large differential for 2020 between Europe and the US. In fact, at the end of Q3, there wasn't much. It's like the second lockdown towards the end of 2020 meant that the end of 2020 numbers look so different. So, I think this is going to be an interesting issue is the kind of GDP dynamics throughout this period, how much is connected simply to the pandemic and the various social restriction measures that were necessary versus how much can be connected to policy measures. Now, I think as we all appreciate, a lot of policy measures were not really to fine-tune GDP. They're disaster relief. And, we have the same issue in Europe of the big increase in household savings that Raquel also mentioned. What's interesting with the household saving debate is, yes, it's interesting and it's going to be important to know if how much of that excess saving will quickly convert into stronger consumption and therefore an accelerated recovery now. But I suppose, more basically, it's pretty important that household balance sheets are now a lot stronger in the aggregate than before the pandemic. Because of course, in many models, that's an important state variable. The concerns about highly leveraged households, many of those households now are in better shape. So yes, it's interesting about what might happen in the coming months, but even if they don't consume in the coming months, the dynamics for the years to come will be quite different. That's a general point. Of course, the reason why households and corporates don't look as bad as would have been the case without policy intervention. The counterpart, of course, is the big increase in sovereign debt. So again, focusing on the differences between Europe and the US, what's interesting and a major issue in the last year is we've had this big increase in public debt ratios, but a big compression in risk premia. And in fact, one of the major kind of information events, if you like, of the last year for the euro area is the fact that Europe responded through joint debt issuance, which is only now, of course, this week is the first actual issue. So the world has revised its beliefs about how Europe operates, in particular, how large events, tail events, might be handled from a fiscal point of view. And this is really, of course, the fact that we at the ECB have a big QE program probably plays some role, but in terms of the timeline of when the risk premia started to narrow, it's closely connected to the announcement of the prospects for joint debt issuance. So this, if you like, this fundamental change in the architecture of the euro area, I think is quite important. This also connects to the kind of what's happening now is the transition from the disaster relief phase of fiscal policy to how to support the recovery. And, of course, there were some delays in these recovery plans. But now, if you look at what's going to happen now for in the next year or two, especially, there's going to be a lot of fiscal spending, which is being financed out of these common resources as opposed to out of national budgets. And so, a lot of lessons were learned from the last set of crises, and so I do think that's important. So, I think. In terms of trying to give a euro area angle, those are some important points. Going back to fiscal, maybe the other point, which is so important, which I know everyone in this panel fully appreciates, is when people express concerns about large fiscal deficits. The history of that is typically twin deficits. It's a large fiscal deficit plus a large current account deficit. And it's the current account deficit which quite often creates macroeconomic adjustment risks, because we know collectively it's very painful if you have to close a big current account deficit in a sudden way. Whereas on this occasion, what we have is an internal shuffling of balance sheets. By and large, these large fiscal deficits have a counterpart of large household surpluses. It is not an increase in net external debt. And that is relevant for future macro dynamics. So maybe I'll stop there.
Thank you, Philip, very much. Carmen?
Well, thank you, Alberto. It's great to be in this panel among old friends. I'm going to try to address briefly two topics or 2 points. One is, important differences in the impacts of the pandemic and the expected recovery in the pandemic, North and South, if you will, and then within South, there's a huge degree of heterogeneity on what can be expected and how hard the pandemic has hit. So that's one area. The other area is very complementary to what we've heard from Raquel and Philip, which is, we hear a lot about monetary policy, we hear a lot about fiscal policy, but there's also was massive financial sector policies during the pandemic in terms of forbearance policies for the repayment of debt by households and firms. And as I said, heterogeneity is key here, but a risk or a concern going forward is what happens when number one, what is revealed after the forbearance measures, and what does it imply for the balance sheets? So those are very quickly. Without trying to make it cliche, the issue of K-shaped recovery is really real here. And you see this in the credit rating agencies' performance over the since COVID began. It's a real contrast to 2008, 2009 and its aftermath. During 2008, 2009, the advanced economies had a very sluggish recovery, had a protracted balance sheet problems, and you saw a proportionately high level of downgrades for the advanced economies, while the emerging markets during that time, emerging markets, developing countries had a rough time in late 2008, early 2009, but the recovery was quite swift. It was importantly fueled by double-digit Chinese growth, by high commodity prices, and ample global financial liquidity. So EMs and developing countries did quite well after 2008, 2009. This is the mirror image of what we're seeing now. If you look at the advanced economies, we've heard, so I'm not going to repeat anything that Raquel and Philip have said, the prospects for a much stronger rebound, much stronger relative to the developing countries and emerging markets, and much stronger relative to the global financial crisis. A big concern, huge concern in the EM developing countries, again, in varying degrees. It's not just, the impact of the pandemic, but its long shadow. It's been setbacks. The World Bank publishes a semi-annual report on poverty and shared prosperity. This has been the first global spike in poverty rates since the late 1990s. You look, you hear the reports on the education front, on the nutrition front, on so many fronts, big setbacks, big increases in poverty also, will I think, raise concerns about social instability and so on that I will not get into. But fueling, I think, some of the disparity between the advanced and emergings is, of course, the kinds of monetary and fiscal stimulus that the advanced economies have had. Most emerging markets, developing countries, do not have that capacity or space to do it on that scale. Of course, you know, it importantly also depends on what position, you know, how solid was the initial conditions, the pre-COVID initial conditions. Let me say that among the poorest countries, these are the 73 countries that are eligible for the debt suspension service initiative. More than half of them are either in debt distress already or at a high risk, you know, the highest risk level to an imminent episode of debt distress. And so, you know, the initial conditions were already poor, and the slow vaccination rates, the longer waves, and the lack or relative, limited scope of the fiscal and monetary responses is bottom line. Expectation is a protracted recovery. And by recovery, let me be very clear. By recovery, I mean per capita GDP. You know, the way that I've written about and thought about recovery, you know, it's easy to get confounded with rebound, you know, looking at a lot of indicators snapping back after deep declines last year. But by recovery, I mean, how long will it take for per capita income to get back to what it was pre-crisis? And I think the answer to that for many EMs is it'll be 3 years in a good scenario and maybe longer. And this is very tied to the issue that I raised about the quieter financial crisis or the quieter financial problems. A big catalyst for recovery is credit, new credit. And you know, there are emerging concerns that during the pandemic, because of these large forbearance policies, there is less of a clear-cut sense of what share of assets of financial institutions are non-performing. So, and at the end of some of these forbearance programs, how many will be insolvent and how many will be illiquid? Will we have a zombie firm problem? You know, that continued support is given to sectors of the economy, possibly some in services or in tourism, where, you know, the recovery will not be possible because of insolvency issues. I'll conclude by saying that in addition to, I think, the deeper damage along many development fronts, the concern is that the firepower, monetary, more limitations because of concerns about inflation, fiscal, because of concerns about debt, and debt has real big teeth in many of these countries. And on the financial side, the concern is that if household firms and financial sectors have more impaired balance sheet, then balance sheet repair often entails a period of subpar new lending. So those are the big risks, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Carmen. Andrés?
Thanks very much. Good afternoon, good morning. Thank you to our friends in Barcelona for this invitation. Delighted to be among dear friends on this panel. I'm going to focus also on emerging and developing countries, and I'm going to echo and maybe expand on many of the points that Carmen already made, which I think are very, very important. Let me begin by quoting the first paragraph in the first section of the Global Economic Prospects document, which Carmen's shop put out about 10 days ago. And it reads like this. It says, in a nutshell, the world economy is experiencing a strong but highly uneven recovery. Growth is concentrated in a few major economies, with poorer countries lagging behind. So this is K recovery to the nth power. Not only do we have an uneven recovery, we also have an uneven and you might say unfair recovery, because the rich are doing well and the poor are doing badly. As Carmen pointed out, among developed countries, you had a big, sharp drop, but you're having a big, sharp recovery, and therefore GDP levels, whether absolute or per capita, will be in their pre-pandemic position, in some cases at the end of this year, certainly in the course of next year. That is not true for most emerging markets. That is not true for most developing countries. GDP levels, and particularly, as Carmen said, per capita GDP levels may take 3, 4, 5 years to recover, if that. So the question is, why the difference? What can we learn about the sources of this difference? And more importantly, this is a policy panel. What can we do about it? I think there are at least 3, and there are probably more, but given limited time, I'm going to focus on 3 differences. The obvious one is differences in vaccination rates. The speed with which you can open up depends on the speed with which you can get jabs into people's arms. Not all developing countries are doing badly. In my corner of the world, Uruguay, my own country, Chile, a number of others are doing okay. There are some countries in East Asia, there are some countries in the Middle East where vaccination is proceeding apace. But in the larger developing countries, whether in Latin America, in Asia, or in Africa, vaccination is very slow. And this is partially an issue of money. It is partially an issue of logistics and state capacity. And of course, there is also an issue of a world vaccine market, which is not working very well, which is not very transparent, and where more powerful and richer countries can get their hands on vaccine supplies much more easily than developing countries. The second difference, Carmen mentioned this, but I want to stress it and maybe just dig a little bit deeper, is the differences in the fiscal response. If I go and look at the recent issues of the IMF Fiscal Monitor, as shares of GDP, rich countries did a discretional fiscal response to COVID, which was larger than 10% of GDP. Emerging market economies, that is to say, middle-income countries, did half of what the rich countries did. And developing countries, that is to say, low-income countries, did half of what the middle-income countries did, and as a result, did barely 1/4 of what the rich countries did. That is to say, I like to quote my friend Mauricio Cárdenas, who used to be the finance minister of Colombia. Rich countries could afford to do whatever it takes, the old Mario Draghi line. Poor countries and middle-income countries did whatever they could afford. And this means, of course, that many, not just on the demand side, but also on the supply side, even on the humanitarian side, many of the expenditure items which could have reduced scarring, which could have made sure that balance sheets were in a good position, which could have saved jobs, those were not in place in developing countries. And as a result, it is not surprising that we're seeing a much slower recovery. The third one, which is talked about a little bit less, but which I think is very, very important, is differences in labor markets. I live in the United Kingdom. A lot of people were getting what in the UK they call a furlough payment. So if you have a formal job and the government is paying your salary or 75, 80% of your salary, well, you stay home, you watch Netflix, end of story. In most developing countries and emerging markets, this was not the case. First of all, because they are, most of them, either agricultural or especially, not so much ag anymore, but especially service economies, you need face-to-face contact. You can run a university online, you cannot run a restaurant or a shop online. Secondly, because of informality, it was very, very hard for governments to step in and say, I will pay part of your salary. I can pay part of your salary if you have a salary, that is to say, if you have a contract. If you have no contract, if you have no salary, as a result, preserving those employment relationships and of course, helping keep up the purchasing power of that wage of that family became much, much harder. And in addition, the informality and weakness of labor markets even posed difficulties for the government response. There were many developing countries in which you had the money, and nonetheless, governments did not have a good role of where people were, how to reach them, and of course, many did not have checking accounts, and therefore providing financial assistance was much, much harder. Bottom line, you've seen a lot of job destruction in emerging markets. Some of those jobs, people who are selling candy on the street, as soon as they're allowed to do so, will go back to selling candy on the street. But where you had a matching problem, the restaurant which had found the right cook and had found the right waiters and had found the right personnel staff, those people have moved on. Productivity in that business will be lower, employment creation will probably be slow, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So developing countries, I think, paid a much larger price from a point of view of human welfare, but are also going to pay a much larger price in terms of the speed and depth of recovery. Let me just end by highlighting three analytical issues, which I don't have the time to go into, but which I think we ought to be thinking about. The first one is, why was there so little financing in this crisis for emerging and developing countries? In some sense, this is a standard temporary shock that we teach students about, which should have called for larger current account deficits. You borrow to get over the hump, you repay later. What you see in a lot of countries that are middle income or low income is that current account deficits shrank, and in some cases became surpluses, which is exactly what the doctor did not order. So the question is, were they simply too weak, too shy? They did not want to borrow? Was it a demand of credit problem? Or was it a supply of credit problem? Either capital markets broke down or financing available from institutions like the IMF was insufficient. The fund told the world that emerging countries and developing countries would need 2 billion to get over the pandemic. The fund said, we have 1 trillion available. And in the end, depending on how you do the accounting, COVID-related lending by the fund was under 200 billion. So that's one issue. Why so little capital flow? Is it supply or is it demand? Analytical issue number two is, what exactly is the debt carrying capacity of emerging markets? As Raquel was saying at the outset, Philip said it too, with interest rates, even long interest rates at zero, it's pretty easy to carry debt in emerged developed nations. Is it the same in developing countries? There's probably a greater ability to carry debt today, but I would guess not as large as you might see in the US or the UK or Japan. But where's the limit? What should we be looking at? If I had more time, I'd go into this. Maybe we'll have a chance to talk about it later. And analytical issue number three, what is going to happen in emerging market labor markets as you have the shock of the pandemic, the pre-existing condition of informality, and the upcoming shock of automation, robots, and the potential for hollowing out? This is, probably good for productivity to have robots doing a lot of tasks in the long run. But of course, we know that job destruction is fast, job creation is slow, the transition can be very, very painful. And of course, the political implications and social implications of that can be very dire indeed. Lots of issues to think about, too little time. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andres, very much. Let me just make two comments that maybe I will also pile in the back burner for later on. I'm a bit found it interesting that neither Raquel nor Philip expressed particular concern for government debt. So maybe we can come back to that later on. And maybe for Carmen and Andres, one thing I would like to know your opinion on is whether advanced economies should be doing more for the rest of the world. I'm sure you're aware of this report by the IMF about using advanced economy funds to vaccinate the world economy very quickly, and basically that this would have enormous benefits even for advanced economies, among other things, by preventing further strains from developing and so on. So maybe that's something we can return to later on. Let's move then to the more medium-term perspectives. Briefly, for a few minutes each, what do you think will be the lasting legacy of this? Either costs or opportunities, or both? Andres was alluding to technological change, which maybe may be accelerated. So maybe we can do it in backward fashion now. So we begin with Andres and then move down Carmen, Philip, and Raquel at the end.
Yeah. Well, let me elaborate a little bit on the labor market issue, which I think is paramount, and at least in middle-income countries, maybe it does not get the attention that it deserves. If you follow policy debates in middle-income countries, a lot of the income distribution debate is focused around wages. So the rich have wages, the poor have low wages, and that is the focus of the discussion. But of course, for the welfare of a family, it doesn't just matter what the wage is of the head of household. It also matters how many people are working in that household. It also matters how many hours. Is it full-time? Is it part-time, etc. A very striking feature of distribution in developing countries is that the differences in total household income are not simply accounted by differences in wages. In the city where I was born, Santiago, Chile, if you go to the richest municipality, there are 2.7 wages per household. Both parents work, and a daughter or a son also works at least part-time. If you go to the poorest municipality in the metropolitan region of Santiago, on average, you don't have half a wage per household. And therefore, access to work is absolutely key from a welfare point of view, from a distribution point of view, and needless to say, from a growth and productivity point of view. So what I take away from this pandemic is that this is the elephant in the room that we're not talking about. The things that I said in my earlier remarks were mostly backward looking. They were about the things that went wrong with the pandemic. The question is, what can we do about it? The first issue is political. Labor market issues are very political. I suffered that. A good deal of the gray hair I have in my head comes from my failure at making much of a dent in labor legislation. It's very, very hard. You change one comma of labor code and the business community doesn't like it. You change another comma someplace else and the labor unions and the labor community doesn't like it. It is very hard to make progress. But so my first hope is maybe the tremendous shock of the pandemic has shifted the political equilibrium a little bit. We can have a conversation that is less ideological. Secondly, for developing and emerging markets, the technological change is both bad and good. Clearly, a lot of the jobs which are your ticket to middle-class status in developing countries are going to be automated out of existence. How do you make it out of poverty? Well, you work as a teller in a bank, you work behind a cash register in a shop, you drive a taxi, or you drive a bus. It's a pretty good guess that all those 4 jobs won't really exist 10 years from now. In London this morning, I was trying to find a bank office just, to do a bit of banking, old-fashioned, face-to-face banking. There are none in central London anymore. I suspect that will also be the case elsewhere. On the other hand, the Zoom revolution may also be good news for some developing countries, particularly for middle-income countries. I said earlier that they have mostly become service economies. The question is, can you be an exporter of services? Raquel's country, Argentina, has pretty high human capital. It has a lot of unemployed architects, and very good ones at that. Could Argentine architects be actually, drawing up plans and doing buildings in Beijing or in Berlin? 10 years ago, it was hard. You had to travel, Today, it may be easier. I have architect friends all over Latin America who are actually participating in big building projects outside Latin America. So maybe there is good news here. There is some room for becoming exporters of professional services, financial services, other kinds of services over Zoom. But all of this will require lots of regulatory changes. Try doing that, try sorting out the regulatory issues, try sorting out the tax issues, try sorting out the social security issues associated with labor exports or professional service exports. It is all very difficult. So I see three things. I see a shock, which may cause people to pay attention. I see a tremendous threat in job destruction, both from the lingering effects of the pandemic and technological change. But I also see an opportunity. To take advantage of that opportunity, we will need regulatory changes and legal changes that I'm afraid not every middle-income country is thinking about or ready to carry out.
Thank you, Andrés. It's not even obvious voters in advanced economies will like this too much, but
yeah, of course,
Carmen,
architects in particular.
Exactly. Carmen?
So, in terms of the more medium-term challenges, I think the three big recurring themes that have been stressed here and come up all the time, the issue of more inequality, more poverty, in more debt, all in varying degrees, of course, by country. The problem with all those three is their intrinsic asymmetry. They can go up very quickly, but the reversal has historically been sluggish. The working down of poverty rates was stretched out over decades, a couple decades at least. The spike came in 1 year. The average duration of a debt crisis in the post-war, if you actually look at the last 200 years, is even longer. It's close to 9 years. So that is for countries that do fall into debt distress, the exit is usually about 8 years later. That's a long time. And here, let me clarify. I mean exit. I don't mean having one restructuring and then a year later having a second restructuring, and then another year and a half later, a third restructuring, because that's all part of the same debt crisis. And we saw that in the 1980s. So without melodrama, I think for the EMs and developing countries, this is again with huge variation. A protracted recovery is a great danger because it also fuels adverse debt dynamics and puts them at greater risk of being able to do least when they need it most. And so, I think we've sort of been lulled into this, in my view, entirely false sense of security on R minus G and all of that. That's great, when R is very low. But for many developing countries and emerging markets, the debt servicing soaks up a huge share of revenue. in the most dramatic case, of course, they are an outlier. But during 2020 in Nigeria, debt servicing accounted for, more than 90% of revenues. Of course, they have an exceptionally low revenue base, but I'm dramatically emphasizing that point, but the differences are vast in the amount of resources that go to debt servicing. So, and there are two concerns that I have that I'd like to, and these apply to both advanced and emerging over the medium term. My own takeaway is the economics professor hasn't usually covered itself in glory in calling big turning points. We usually, are more about, there's some big persistence, there's some big unit root problem, and the pandemic has also had big supply shock effects. Big changes in global supply chains, big changes in transport costs, big impacts on tourism and services related to it. And in the 1970s, the oil shock was a very measurable, very identifiable supply shock. We don't have the equivalent of that now, but that there are important supply issues, and they're connected to many of the labor market issues, of course, that Andrés has already discussed as well. So supply shocks, have more lasting consequences. And my sense is we still do not have grasped fully what that supply shock will be. That is connected also to another inflection point. Have we been lulled by the post-Volcker era of declining inflation and declining interest rates into think that this time it will not happen? That is a risk. I think sorting out to what extent the inflation pickup that we're seeing, and it is global, okay? If you think that the advanced economies, it's even more pronounced in EMs. And worryingly, it is also, inflation is a tax. It is a regressive tax. And one of the reasons it is a regressive tax is that the inflation rebound has importantly also been concentrated in food prices, which of course, soak up the largest share of the budget in low-income countries and in the low-income households within those countries. Another source of concern is, are we at inflection points on the aggregate supply shock issue, on the inflation front? They're obviously connected. I don't have a really good sense on that, but I think some of the indicators that we have been talking about, some of the changes that we have been talking about would suggest that, the viewing this as a temporary shock is not really appropriate. And even if it is a temporary shock, it will leave a lasting legacy. I do think, high levels of debt are part of that legacy. And I think that will be a constraining factor, much less so in the advanced economies, but even there, in the future course of both monetary and fiscal policy, and also the possibility of responding to future shocks. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Carmen. Philip, do you want to follow up on that?
Sure. And again, maybe to kind of continue to try and identify and to differentiate. So I'm not necessarily, Alberto, saying that this is the most important or number one issue, but just in terms of continuing the conversation going, there's clearly, and when I think of medium term, let me be clear, this is not only is the pandemic crisis over, that we've had a full recovery, we're out of this. So several years from now. So let me be clear, because it's important to think about what we mean with these phrases such as the medium term. So we're out of this. We're back to pre-crisis trend. Let's be optimistic, and it's in the past. But what is interesting is a bit like the Great Depression. We know it had long-lasting effects on lots of people's behaviour. That there's going to be a lot of interesting issues here. Of course, for individuals, as individual consumers, as individual investors. But a big question for governments is really going to be this issue about, do we need to plan better for the future? I mean, plan for future pandemics, plan for basically large disasters. Now, on this occasion, we scrambled and we found, at least in the advanced economies, we had the capability to create the fiscal space, the monetary space, and so on. But it's an interesting issue about, because you said earlier on that I wasn't expressing concerns about fiscal debt, but I think we have a consistent view, which is fiscal policy needs to support the recovery, the rebound, the recovery for a sustained period. So jumping ahead after that, I also say that forward-looking fiscal policymakers will have to consider what kind of fiscal space is needed just in case for future shocks. And as I think everyone on this call has contributed to in various ways, it's the political economy of generating large enough surpluses. I know Andres had a good record when copper prices were high in Chile, but in general, that's a big issue. Especially when there's counter narratives about what might drive fiscal policy. Let me go back again in terms of how we ought to think about the world economy, because Andres brought it up and Carmen brought it up in different ways, which is the future of globalization. So the optimistic view is with the acceleration in digitalization, maybe we could have a new era of globalization in services. You know, that is there. That cuts both ways, by the way, Andres. I'm aware of Irish architects who've done pretty good work in Latin America. So it's a two-way gains from trade. But right. Because I mean, Carmen is right about the global component of inflation, but it's quite concentrated in goods inflation, and it's not even consumer goods yet, it's lower levels. And when services are 2/3 of the consumer price basket, you know, the kind of overall impact on overall inflation dynamics is maybe more contained. And we know income expenditure shares mean that more and more the overall expenditure weights are on services. So what you said is a big call about how important the global component will be if as the trend in services expenditure goes up. And then the other point here is right now when we see a lot of big price movements, part of this is a terms of trade movement. For Europe, it's a terms of trade decline. Import prices are growing a lot more quickly than export prices at the moment. And of course, in how we think about the welfare implications of that, the macroeconomic implications of that, of course, there's going to be two sides to that about, are you a net exporter of the commodities, the goods that are rising in price? Are you a net importer? And of course, that's a classic international economics question. I want to come back to what Andre said about the capital flows in this period, because I think this is going to be something we need to look at for a long time. Clearly, last spring, there was a kind of dash for cash and a dash for home. So there would have been a period, not just emerging markets, but also parts of Europe, where there was kind of run for the exit. But you know, at some point, that's no longer true. And it's an interesting question about, you know, what are driving investor decisions at this point, and that's a complicated question. But I think there's a huge research question there about thinking about the question Andres posed about the direction of capital flows. And this goes back to the global nature of a pandemic, because we know from the hurricane and earthquake literature, countries do run current account deficits typically who suffer that. But when it's a global shock, it's interesting what we're observing. Let me stop there.
Many thanks, Philip. Okay, I'm back to Raquel. We have not forgotten you, Raquel. Now,
I wasn't worried. So anyway, those were great comments by Carmen, Andres, and Philip. So let me see what I can add to that. First of all, I think that what could be a medium-term crisis, if we don't do something about it on the short term, is truly global vaccination. Mm-hmm. To me, it's only a question of time, and maybe this, betrays my science fiction background, but science fiction background is based on science. It's only a question of time before we do get a mutation that does get through these vaccines, that do get through the Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, et cetera. So the idea that we can, calmly wait and say that our countries or Europe or the US are done, or even parts of Latin America, that's just false. So I would see that as the number one short-term thing to take care of as a global emergency, because we are going to be facing this all over again, just far too soon otherwise. So that's the first kind of short to medium term. Then, the things that everyone brought up was inequality and poverty. And at the US level, I'm worried about the lack of appetite to tackle these challenges now that we are spending so much in distributing in short-term measures. Maybe we will get through this infrastructure packages, and maybe it'll be sufficiently ambitious. And just to relate to one of the questions that came out in the Q&A, within that infrastructure package needs to be a system by which the government can get money to people when they need it. I mean, the unemployment insurance programs and the welfare programs in general in the United States are incredibly rickety. They're at the state level. Each state has different rules, and it's very hard to get payments to pay people. So you saw payments coming in burst. Part of that was because of what Congress was doing it, but part of it is just because it's just hard to get money to people. Does that give people an appetite to work? It's not really clear. It's just not clear. Okay, so the other, the part of the inequality and poverty that then relates to what was brought up by Andres about robotization and automation and what we're going to do about it. I think that, the medium-term challenge for a large part of the world, certainly for the US and the EU, but for a large part of the world, I don't have any imaginative solution for developing economies, is, how are we going to deal with the generations that are going to be hurt by this transition? And, how do we handle the political economy of that? So we have this hollowing out of the middle that's been going on. What kind of innovative training programs can we put up? What kind of basic income programs can we put up that only goes to that generation, only to that group of people, so that it does not lack legitimacy? Again, I think that the amount of inequality, the amount of poverty, and the lack of political appetite in the United States is going to make that for the US very hard to do anything about. Of course, this is a worldwide challenge, not the robotization, and not only the robotization and automation, but just poverty and inequality. And again, I'm worried about a lack of political will towards these things. I'm going to come back to the political economy problem in 1 second. I just want to say one thing about, the R versus G debt problem. I do think that the fact that, the safe rate of return is smaller than the growth rate on average for most economies, in the medium run, does mean we can live with higher debt levels. I completely, agree with Carmen that there's problems with that. We don't want to live through the crisis all over again. We do not want to see renegotiation of debt time after time, not because renegotiating the debt is bad, but because it completely paralyzes the economy. So I guess the way I would say it, Carmen, is that we want to worry about the second moment. We want to worry about shocks that will raise our above G, because any raising of R above G will make life very, very difficult. So we need to, in our analysis, take care of that stochastic component and not just the expected value of R relative to G. So that is fine. But I guess the main thing I wanted to think about is the political economy part. I think that one thing that we've seen and that's been exaggerated or come into relief because of the pandemic, but it was obviously building up for a long time, is a mistrust of all institutions. In the United States, you see this incredibly clearly. There is absolutely no institution I can think of these days that commands any sort of respect. This is true for the US Supreme Court, which was politicized a long time ago. It's true for the media, which is fragmented all over the place. It's true for the Center of Disease Control that told people first not to wear masks, then to wear masks, and has sent out conflicting messages. Definitely true for the US Congress. It's true for the police. The Food and Drug Administration in the United States that says what you can give to consumers, just came out with approving an Alzheimer's drug, to which you ended up with part of the scientific committee resigning because it had not been shown to be efficacious. There is basically there's no institution in the United States that commands respect. This not only has short-term costs of increasing, deaths, increasing, the lack of economic will, political will to do things. It also erodes respect for democratic institutions. So here, Alberto, I might be leading into our third long-term challenge, but I do think this is a challenge for the entire world, certainly for the US. What are we going to do about the fact that democracy might become less respected, and what are the dangers that come out of that? Andres was able to raise things as just interesting questions, so I'm just going to raise that as an important question for the world rather than try to answer that. Now, if you want, if we want to, Alberto, is it okay if I sort of segue into a little bit the longer term challenges at the same time?
If it's very quick, it's perfectly okay.
Perfect, excellent. So if I think about the longer term challenges, well, first of all, we need a more resilient, we need a more environmentally sustainable national and global economy. We haven't said green economy and the climate crisis just because I think we all know it so well, but it's still there. It's not going away. That's a huge thing. Second, health is a global public good. The pandemic made much more salient the costs of inequality and poverty, both nationally and internationally. Pandemics and the environment, they both require global solutions and global insurance policies. I think we should come out of this with a will to have a global insurance policy for the next crisis. We can, I think it was Andres who was asking, well, why haven't countries borrowed more? Is it supply or demand? I don't have an answer for it. I do know that it's incredibly costly that they did not borrow more. It is incredibly costly. It's incredibly costly at a human scale, incredibly costly for the economic growth of these countries. So we do need a global insurance policy. And then my big love has always been education. And so I'll end with that, Alberto. The quality of education for a large part of the population in the US, but internationally as well, is abysmally low. The pandemic has created scars here, both in the US and in the world for a generation. I mean, there's going to be human capital losses as a result of this, but just in general, even without a pandemic, this gap between the top and the bottom is increasing. It's really costly to not have an educated population. It's costly to have a population that does not understand basic science. It does not understand that not taking off a mask, that keeping a mask on in a room is because of the ventilation. To me, it's amazing how many universities and secondary schools and other institutions did not seem to understand the issue of ventilation. So it's having a population that does not understand basic science means that it can be very easily manipulated. Having a population that does not have a certain level of education means they're easy to manipulate in a whole other senses, and leads basically, I think, to a population that's ripe for being anti-democratic. So I'll end there. Thanks.
Okay, that's a pretty order concern, but that's okay. Okay, we had one last question, which was if you had to pick one single policy that you think is incredibly high return, which one would it be? But since we've been discussing for so long, let me interject some questions from the audience, and then feel free to allude to your preferred policy if you want in your response, because we have here a number of questions. So I'm going to post them so that everyone who is listening can hear them. Some are about fiscal policy. So Fernando Bronner, for instance, from CREI says, I guess Philip or anyone else can tackle this. Isn't the recovery plan in Europe coming way too late? Would it not be better to spend these resources, I guess, to reduce individual countries' public debts instead of the green economy, the digital economy, etc.? So I guess the concern there is whether this money is coming a bit too late and we could use it just to reduce debt burdens. Roberto Chang, Andres, your co-author and friend, I guess, he has a question. I guess this is both for you and Carmen. Is there a role for the international financial institutions, such as the World Bank, to become more involved in financing vaccination for the developing world, i.e., doing whatever it takes in this regard? Raquel, you had a question that you already answered about money reaching people. So let me, the other question I have here, which echoes a bit my own concerns, I keep coming back to this. Basically, this is by José Luis Pedro, professor and researcher here at the Barcelona GSE. Given the huge level of private and public debt and given the emerging market problems, how do you see the effects of potential tightening of core countries' monetary policy going forward? Canada and Norway already started, and the US is slightly changing its stance. I guess I could add to this that, is there a concern that even core countries' monetary policy may be constrained by the huge overhang of public debt, in the sense that when the time comes to raise rates, this might be hard to do. So if you think it's okay, we can start with these three questions. Well, there is one by Rebecca Pierce Lopez. Let me add this since Raquel mentioned this. Considering the commitment to reach zero net emissions by 2050, where do you see the intersection between promoting policies that mitigate CO2 emissions and policies that promote economic recovery after COVID-19? How do we ensure that these policies help those who are at the lower end of the income distribution? So this is very much in line with what you were saying, Raquel. So I don't know, Phil, do you want to start, Philip?
Sure, and there are interconnections here, because I mean, of course, it's not totally surprising that the focal point for the joint European prioritization in these recovery plans is basically to accelerate the twin transitions of digitalization and the green transition. And it's important to understand they're quite intertwined, because of course, digitalizing the economy is very central to the carbon transition on all sorts of ways, because of course, reducing the amount of travel we have to do is important for the carbon transition. Digitalization is very important in managing energy power systems, smart meters, all of that. So, I mean, in many ways, probably it's best thought of it as an integrated priority, digitalization and the green transition. And this goes to it's interesting now because these plans have now been written, they've been scrutinized. And actually, in contrast to Fernando, and I'm not saying it's intentionally designed like this, the timing where we're now unlocking the European economy at the same time when this money is about to start to flow, it is actually maybe quite a nice correlation there, because essentially the disaster relief phase up to now has been able to be funded through national balance sheets. But of course, both digitalization and the green transition have a huge cross-border externality. So identifying the European level of funding with areas which basically it's kind of a positive externalities across borders is maybe a good allocation of tasks. And what we know from 15 years ago is a big problem is when you're tempted to go into fiscal retrenchment, public investment tends to get hit first, because politically it's an easy target. So the fact we now have a 5-year window where there's a lot of protection for broadly defined public investment is important. It's important that it's kind of lines up with those being hit hardest by the pandemic and lower income countries in the euro area. And by the way, within that, there's a lot of front loading between now and 2023. So in terms of supporting the recovery, I can, I'm looking very closely at these numbers, and it's a lot of support there. So, I mean, it's an interesting kind of factual that is raised about, there's different kind of, what would have happened if this announcement had not happened, if this plan did not come about? Also, what would happen if there was no restrictions on how you might use these funding? But of course, it's very natural that Europe is going to have a very structured approach, given that it is a jointly issued debt funding this. But I think it's demanding, but I think it's a good design. And maybe importantly, there's a lot of what's classified in the fiscal accounts as capital transfers in some countries, which is basically helping basically a lot of households retrofit their homes. And presumably, by and large, a lot of this would be skewed towards lower income households. So there is, I think, a degree here of identifying where and also I think there's a lot of climate justice support there as well, in going back to the hollowing out and those who are losing from the carbon transition. So, it's going to be a long running story. It's vitally important that this works well. But I think in terms of the design phase and the initial launch phase, let alone the financing phase, I think there's been a lot of good practice embedded.
Thank you, Philip. Yes, let's hope it works. Maybe we can let Andres and Carmen comment on the other questions. And then Philip, if you want to say something about fiscal and monetary direction, you can come back to that. I don't know who wants to take the floor, Andres or Carmen.
Carmen?
Okay, happy to. Those questions I will connect to the medium and longer term and eternal term problems that Alberto, you asked us to speak on. And it's also connected to a point that Andres made. And, the issue is time immemorial. What does it take, for capital to flow from rich to poor countries? Is a big question, and it is a critical question during times of stress. We have a financial architecture that reinforces cycles for much of the developing and emerging world. Capital flows, private capital flows tend to be pro-cyclical. And then when the bad times come, official capital is insufficient to offset usually the reversals in private capital flows. This is a serious problem because deep protracted downturn make pre-existing structural problems worse. And that was a problem last century. It was a problem 50 years ago. And if you look forward, it's still an unsolved problem. Guillermo Calvo, my dear friend and mentor, has for decades highlighted, emerging markets, developing countries do not have a real central bank. And this, let me just highlight the limitations and why this is a big issue going forward in the existing setup. During the pandemic, which is, synchronized to a different order of magnitude. In recent work that I've been doing with Catherine Holstrom and Graciela Kaminsky, we look at the synchronicity of the output declines in 2020, and they surpassed, Great Depression, the First World War, and the Second World War. It's really, and so if ever you had a need for a global institution, something very much akin to a lender of last resort, this was the moment. And you know, if you look at the policy response, in a nutshell, because I'm just going to focus on highlights. Each, as it's expected, each central bank focused on its own. Of course, there are, you know, international spillovers, especially for the Fed and the ECB, but they focused on their own issues. So apart from lowering interest rates, high yield corporates had a lender of last resort. Facilities were created. State and local governments in the US had a facility, you know, created. Main Street, you know, commercial banks had a facility created. Now, the G20 tried to recreate this to some degree with the DSSI, saying, okay, we are going to allow you a moratoria so that instead of repaying debt to your creditors, you redirect the funds as needed for the emergency. The takeaway from that experience, it was a step in the right direction. It was underwhelming. It was underwhelming. There was zero private sector participation. And the participation in the official sector did not extend to the multilaterals. And the largest global bilateral creditor, which is larger than the Paris Club combined, China, only participated halfway, even less than halfway, because so you have all these facilities that helped corporates, helped households, helped banks in the advanced world, and there was no single facility to say during the height of the pandemic, when capital flows had a sudden stop in 6 weeks in the spring, a major reversal. There was no stabilizing force from a financial institution, a central bank that would buy this debt to stabilize it. And so we have big architectural holes, and this is not an academic point. Going forward, a big concern, as I said, the average duration of negotiating debt is 8 years. In 1990, almost 60% of the emerging markets and developing economies had per capita incomes below what they were in 1980. And part of that was also very much connected to lack of access to new financing and the inability to tackle a debt overhang. So we have big architectural challenges ahead. And I'll conclude by saying that the question on monetary, am I concerned about the tightening, potential tightening in advanced economy policies? Yes. The good news of the recovery, the sharp recovery in the US and in Europe and China, has been higher commodity prices, which are helping EMs, higher commodity prices. Unambiguously, at least for the commodity exporters, good news. The bad news is that the overheating side may lead to a rise in yields that is disproportionately high because of risk premium multipliers, which could already make what is a comparatively frail situation even more frail. And let me stop there, but all those issues I think are importantly connected to this north-south finance failure that we've had for centuries.
Thank you, Carmen. Andrés?
I could not agree more with 99.9% of what Carmen just said. let me, at the risk of getting it wrong, try to summarize it in a sentence or two. The capital markets, the private capital markets froze in March, April, much of May of last year. They remained depressed for a good chunk of the second half of the year. And we had no credible multilateral public alternative to that. We can think of it in terms of the Calvo hypothesis that you need a lender of last resort, a sort of a world central bank or some central bank that will assist countries in need. We can think of it as a failure of pooling. You can imagine that, a portfolio of a number of emerging markets is safer than a single emerging market. So maybe we could aggregate them. We could have funds. There's a lot of policy engineering, a lot of financial engineering, potentially a lot of political engineering that one can imagine. But the bottom line is that, as Raquel said, the human cost, the financial cost is gigantic, but the social, employment, and human cost of having had countries in the middle of the Depression being forced, in addition to all of it, to reduce their imports, to reduce their expenditure, to cut back on current account deficits, it's just dramatic. And it's dramatic not only from the point of view of those countries alone, it is dramatic from the point of view of world welfare. First of all, because if you put China in, emerging and developing countries are 2/3 of world GDP. So it matters whether they buy. And secondly, because as the cliche goes, we're not all safe until everybody is safe. So the potential for the pandemic being continued by economic problems, social problems, health policy problems in developing countries is absolutely gigantic. And in this regard, multilateral financing for vaccines is low-hanging fruit. We're talking about pennies in the big scheme of things. Last weekend, the G7 met at lovely Carvis Bay in Cornwall, and they walked away with a big announcement, which sounded very good, but the actual money amounts are tiny. The actual money amounts are not very big. And, I haven't done the calculation. I'm not sure I would know how to do the calculation, but the truth is that the world payoff in terms of the safety of rich citizen country loans, of having the risk of contagion diminish, the risk of new strains developing diminish, it is gigantic. So it seems to me this is obviously low-hanging fruit. The financial amounts are not large, the potential gains are huge, but somehow the politics is simply not making this possible. Last but not least, I just want to say one thing in reference to the politics of it all. It is quite striking that if you look at polling data around the world, the collapse of citizen confidence in all kinds of institutions is absolutely overwhelming. Raquel cited data from the US, which is a big rich country. If you look at small rich countries, if you look at large poor countries, and if you look at everything in between, you ask people, do you trust your government? Do you trust the courts? Do you trust parliament? Do you trust the police? Do you trust the church in Catholic countries? And people say no. Do you trust the media, prosecutors? So we have a massive problem of institutional legitimacy and institutional credibility. And those of us from Latin America know that when that happens, the typical answer is not a good answer, but it's a popular answer, is populism, demagoguery, and backsliding into authoritarianism. So we're seeing that. We're seeing that across the world. We in Latin America thought we had invented populism and it was encapsulated there. Far from it. We're seeing Latin American populism today. I will not name any countries because, I don't want Philip to scold me later, but, there's some large countries in Asia that begin with I, and some islands in Asia that begin with, P. Lots of countries in the eastern and central portion of Europe, let alone Latin America, populism both of the right and of the left is absolutely rampant. And this is not only bad for economic performance, it is bad for democracy. It is bad for human freedom. It is bad for human dignity. And I fear that we have not taken stock of how grave and how dangerous that situation is.
Thank you, Andres. We are almost out of time. So Raquel, if you want to add something, but it would have to be, please, very, very short. And then maybe we can, I don't know, Philip, if you want to add something.
Yeah.
You do?
Yeah.
Okay,
well,
but
Raquel first, Raquel, and then I'll.
Okay, very good, Raquel. But we have to cram everything in 3 minutes, so I don't abuse of your time. But Raquel, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I just want to say, I wouldn't call it, I think populism is misused as a word because I think there's some very positive aspects of populism, which then get swept under the rug with all the bad aspects. I do think that's a giant concern. I do think that a global insurance institution and the push from developed countries and the political will from the developed countries is the most important thing to do for the longer term right now. Yeah, I'll just end it with that.
Many thanks, Raquel. Philip?
So I just want to make a European connection to this narrative because in Europe, the popularity of the euro has gone up quite a bit in the surveys, which goes back actually that, of course, there's been a 20-year debate about the pros and cons of monetary union and a common currency. But in relation to how to handle a large common shock, having a domestically denominated currency from a European point of view, having a central bank that can act in a fairly energetic way, compared to what the counterfactual if the euro did not exist, whether every member country could have acted in that way is there. And then, as I mentioned earlier on, the reinforced by the innovation of state contingent willingness to issue joint debt. And then the last point is someone asked about, it might have been Fernando again, about the implications of public debt for future monetary policy. I mean, I think the deeper question here is the pandemic was going to do something. And the question is, what are the implications of a lot of sovereign debt versus the alternative of lots of corporate distress and weaker households? So I think the pandemic is going to complicate monetary policy, but in terms of the choices between public debt and private sector debt, I leave that as a homework exercise to work out, which causes more headaches.
I see. So we could say that in developed countries, the response created some risks, but also had benefits. And the developed and emerging world, well, they need a lot more help. This is Anyway, there's many more questions, but I'm afraid we don't have time to address them. We'll invite you sometime in the future. I cannot thank you enough on a personal basis, but also on behalf of the Barcelona GSE for joining us today and sharing your time. I hope next time we can continue the discussion over dinner in Barcelona. Thank you very much.
Here.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.